Hebrews 11. Tonight we're going to start in verse 27. We're looking at Moses and his entry. He has multiple entries, and other people connected with Moses have entries. Hebrews 11:1 tells us, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." And tonight we're going to see that played out very, very specifically in one of the verses that we're going to look at, verse 27, in just a moment. We began dealing with Moses in verse 23. Actually, it's his parents, Amram and Jochebed. In verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child. Remember, that means they saw that he was special in the eyes of God. It's not that he was a good-looking baby, and if he hadn't been, they wouldn't have. There's something special about him. Perhaps they had some special insight from God that God had given them. I'm going to use this child. We don't know that, but the word, when it says that he was a proper child, that's what it means. And they were not afraid of the king's commandment. Their faith, the faith of Amram and Jochebed, led them to defy the ungodly order of the king and save the life of their son. They were also, as a result of their saving his life and then putting him out into the river at 3 months when he could no longer be hidden, and then following along, they were able to get him back. Remember, he was found by the princess and given back to his mother, who was given wages to care for her own son. And she was also able to, during that time of his upbringing, remember, from 3 months when he went into the possession of the princess of Egypt until 4, maybe 5, that he was returned back to the princess of Egypt. And his parents were able to give him guidance towards faith in Jehovah. And it was due in no small part to this guidance. We find in verse 24, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, you remember 40 years, we find in another passage, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. We found out that it was 40 years in Stephen's sermon in Acts. 40 years, when he come to years, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, the short-term benefits of the lifestyle that was offered to it. Verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. So, we've already dealt with those two passages, one dealing with his parents in their faith, and then in Moses' faith, that led him to say, I'm not going to seek the life of luxurious sin. Rather, I'm going to seek the life with God's chosen people, my people by blood. I'm going to choose to be with them and under the trouble that they will be under because of the blessing that will come eventually. And then we come to his next portion here in verse 27. He had faith in a higher authority. Now, as we read this, see if you have the same thoughts that I do. By faith, he forsook Egypt. You're familiar with the story of Moses. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Now, my first thought when I was reading that was, but the reason he left Egypt was because he was afraid of the king. You remember the story. Actually, Moses left Egypt twice. So, we'll give you the first one. Keep your finger here, we'll come back, but turn back to Exodus chapter 2. Let's look at the first time Moses left Egypt, okay? Remember, while you're turning, listen to verse 27 as I read it again. By faith, he, Moses, forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So let's look at Exodus chapter 2, look at verse 11. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, so he's about 40 years old, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to them that did the wrong, Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedst the Egyptian? And Moses, what's the next word there? Feared. Okay. Moses feared. Okay. Keep your finger there. Listen while I read Hebrews 11:27. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. And Moses feared, back here in Exodus 2, and said, Surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled. Fleeing is what you do when you are afeared, right? And he is. He is afraid. Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. This is the first instance of Moses leaving Egypt, and it's certainly not marked by an absence of fear, would you say? It's entirely motivated by fear. So this is not what we're talking about in Hebrews 11:27. Verse 14 very plainly tells us, he feared. Moses fled to Midian, where he would keep the sheep of Jethro for 40 years. So the life of Moses is 3 40s. Okay? He was 40 years in the palace. He was 40 years in the wilderness, the desert of Midian, keeping the sheep of his father-in-law, Jethro. And then he was another 40 years leading roughly 2 to 4 million Hebrews through the Arabian desert. So 3 portions of 40, and we're in the second one here. He's now with Jethro. And it was in the desert that Moses developed his relationship with God. And he came to realize that he wasn't sufficient to do what needed to be done in his own strength. He tried in Exodus chapter 2. Moses thought that he could take God's time frame into his own hands. He saw an injustice happening, and being a strong man, he decided, I can fix this, and he killed the Egyptian. And it didn't go well. And he fled out of fear when he spent 40 years out in the desert keeping sheep. Go ahead.
Was it? I have an awful hard time keeping track of lineage, but he wasn't a Jew.
Moses?
Yeah.
Moses was a Jew.
So, I thought that, but then it said, that he killed the Egyptian. And who was he? He was afraid of Pharaoh when he killed the Egyptian.
He was afraid because he killed an Egyptian, and he thought nobody saw it.
Yes, I understand.
But somebody saw him, and he went out and tried to correct 2 Hebrews, and they said, Who made you the boss? And he suddenly realized, what I did is now common knowledge. This is going to get out, and it's not going to go well for me. So a Hebrew killing an Egyptian would not have gone over well, for sure. That's the reason for his fear.
If they were in slavery, wouldn't they have been killing them regularly?
See,
The Egyptians would have been killing Hebrews, but the Hebrews weren't killing Egyptians.
Well, of course he was actually.
Yeah, because he was a Hebrew. He had chosen to identify.
What about Jethro? What was he?
Jethro was a Midianite, which is a cousin of the sons of Abraham. So
they would have had Moses' laws.
They wouldn't have had Moses' laws yet, because Moses didn't even have Moses' laws yet.
I'm not, yeah.
But
yeah, that's pretty stupid.
Jethro would have known of Jehovah. He would have known of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So there was a connection there, a loose connection. You have all of the sons of Jacob are in Egypt. And you have the sons of Jethro and the other, they're cousins, sort of. So you have the same way that Lot's kids, Moab, who we've talked about fairly regularly, were relation to the sons of Abraham. You know, they're second cousins,
Well,
and so
yeah, the Abrahamic laws, whatever you call that.
the covenant.
Ruth was a Moabite.
Yeah.
Ruth was a Moabite.
Ruth was a Moabite. They would have had they would have known about who they were. That they would have known that when Moses came and said, "I'm a Hebrew," to Jethro, a Midianite, they would have had a connection, a kind of a familial connection initially.
So Pharaoh was not a Jew.
No, Pharaoh's an Egyptian.
So you're talking about three different races, for lack of a better term. Talking about the Hebrews.
We're going to use the same.
Ethnicities would be a better word.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Ethnicities might be, so you have, we're talking about three different people groups essentially.
Yeah.
Okay? You have the Hebrews, okay, who also go by Israelite, Jew, Hebrews, all of those the same, synonyms. So they're slaves. You have the Egyptians, they're the masters, and then you have the Midianites, and they're not involved. Totally other area. That's why when Moses fled, he was fleeing the wrath of Pharaoh, which Pharaoh is the title. It's like president.
Okay.
So you have Pharaoh. He's fleeing Pharaoh, and he flees into a distant country out of Pharaoh's jurisdiction, where he meets Jethro, who would end up being his father-in-law.
So he really just killed the Egyptian because he could.
Well,
Because he lost his temper.
lost his temper, yeah.
Lost his temper.
Yeah.
And Moses, if you read through Exodus, Moses' temper came back and bit him a handful of times.
He
It's the
was,
reason
yeah, he had, I don't know if he had a short fuse as mine, but it didn't take much sometimes to irritate him. I mean,
Well, that being said, we know from the New Testament that Moses was the meekest man to ever live. And yet, he was kept out of the promised land because of his temper. So, yeah, temper got on him a couple times. But
so the letter to the Hebrews that I think, is it Paul wrote the letter to the Hebrews?
we don't know.
We
Some
don't know
people-
for sure.
yeah.
But they're the same Hebrews that he's talking about here in Exodus.
Yeah, but there's about 3,000 years between. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. The relation between the two is, yeah, but they're Jews. Yes. In both cases. Yes. But the Hebrews that Hebrews was written to were Hebrews that were scattered around the Gentile world in the time of Rome, where this is
But they were still Jews.
still Jews.
They were just
Yes.
dispersed.
Yes. Very definitely.
When you speak about him being left out for his temper, I always thought it was, I don't know where I got this, was from him taking credit for bringing water out of the rock.
But if you
hit the rock,
he hit the rock because he was angry. Yeah, he said, "How should we get water for you, you rebels?" And he smacked the rock, and the amazing thing about it is
he got water.
he got water, and so the only one who knew he'd sinned was
God and him.
him and Moses and God, and he was kept out because of that. It's pretty
Yeah.
pretty
I guess
interesting.
I kind of thought that he did that. He was mad, but I think he did that maybe to put on a show for the folks around him. Watch what I can do. Just mad and
Yelling on it.
Could be, or it could be the same temper that causes some guys to put a hole in a drywall. You know, just trying. He was mad and trying to make a point, and he made the point, but he disobeyed God
If you
and
had to,
lost his
if you had
testimony.
to, if you had to handle 2 million rebellious Jews, I think everybody would lose their
Oh,
temper.
Well, I've been on a long car ride with 3 little girls. I can't imagine 3 million people who are out of their heads. But. So Moses is out in the wilderness. So what we're talking about here in Hebrews 11:27, it says that he left not fearing the wrath of the king.
Different king, though, wasn't it?
Different king, perhaps. We don't know. Could be. But this isn't it. This isn't the leaving that this is talking about. He left another time.
but he hadn't in order with this king, because this king's daughter raised him for
Yeah.
a number of years. So he had I don't know if you want to say a relationship, but a familiarity with the king.
Yeah. If you have an interest in archaeology and Bible history, that you can find, we're not exactly sure which king was Pharaoh during the time of Moses. There are lots of different, there are probably 3 main camps, and off the top of my head I couldn't give you which ones they are, but their scholars are not exactly sure. There are a couple kings that kind of fit, where there's one who lost his army in a, kind of like this one would when Moses closed the Red Sea on them. So there are a couple different things that we can allude to, but we don't know exactly. Did Moses leave and come back under the same king? Did Moses leave under one king and come back under another king? Well, 40 years is a long time for a king to reign. So it would stand to reason that he left under one and came back under another, but we don't know that for positive. If you're interested, I can point you towards some resources that would
have been one of his stepbrothers that would have.
Could have been, yeah. I think when we, just by way of discussion, I think it's interesting. Hollywood has given us an awful lot of what we think about when we think of Moses. That we have the 10 Commandments of years back, and then there was a cartoon, The Prince of Egypt, that came out, and we think of Moses as the Prince of Egypt. And yet, my thought is, when I'm reading in Exodus chapter 2, if Moses held all of the power that sometimes we give him in our mind and in our movies, nobody would have cared if he'd have killed an Egyptian taskmaster. They'd have said life was cheap in Egypt. It wasn't a big deal. And so if Moses was in fact the second in command in Egypt, then him killing an Egyptian, they would have said, oh, whatever. Nobody cares. And also, if Moses had that much power, there is no way that two Hebrews would say, who made you master over us? Okay? There's no way that would have happened. So I think probably reading between the lines, because we don't have it, I think Moses was in the palace, but I don't know that Moses would have been the next Pharaoh, or that he was a high-ranking, the prince who held all the power. It doesn't seem like it from Exodus chapter 2. Again, we don't know for sure, but
in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, it says, now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was after he had fled to Midian. And so I think after he came back, he had...
He came back under another
came back under a different... Yep. So it comes back under another king. So you're dealing with two different pharaohs. But he comes back. He fled for fear of the first pharaoh. Okay? We know that from Exodus 2. While he was out in the wilderness, keeping the sheep of Jethro, he saw a bush on the side of a mountain, and it was burning. And he heard a voice, went up there, and identified, and had a conversation with God. God told him, I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And so he did. He went back, and there was a big conversation between he and God. But if you read in Exodus chapter 4 to Exodus chapter 12, you have the whole story of Moses leaving Midian and going back, and all of the confrontation with Pharaoh, and him putting down his staff and it turning into a serpent, and eating the serpents of Pharaoh, and the plagues, and all of that. All of that happens in that. And then we read in Exodus chapter 2, verse 50, thus did all the children of Israel as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they. And it came to pass the selfsame day that the Lord did bring the children of Israel out of the lands of Egypt by their armies. So the first time Moses left, he fled for fear of Pharaoh. The second time, he walked out in full command. In full command of the children of Israel, he walked out. He wasn't running. He was walking at the head of a column, 3 to 5 million, some 4 million, 5 million. All of the estimates are kind of nebulous, but probably 4 million Jews that he's leading out of the land of Egypt. When he left at the head of the children of Israel in the Exodus. And he was forsaking, which is what we read here in verse 27, meaning to finally depart. He leaves to finally depart. This time he left without fear of Pharaoh. Why? Because Pharaoh was just a mere shell of a man at this point. Pharaoh is the ruler of a country that has been absolutely devastated. It's been ruined by 10 plagues. Pharaoh himself is mourning the loss of his firstborn, as are all of the other Egyptian families. Mourning the loss of their firstborn. We read from the firstborn of the cattle to the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the prisoners. So everyone, imagine if America, imagine what would happen. What kind of, whatever the popularity polling of the president is, imagine leading through the 10 plagues. I mean, Pharaoh's popularity is in the ditch. And Moses walks out at the head of a column of 4 million strong, leaving Egypt. And this is what we're talking about. Here in verse 27 of Hebrews, when it says that he left, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured. Moses endured, meaning he was steadfast, he was persevering, as seeing him who was invisible. Look at verse 1 of Hebrews 11. What's it say again? Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And Moses was able to, by faith, lead the children of Israel out, not in fear. He walked out with his head held high because he was seeing that which was invisible. He knew God's doing this. God has just destroyed this kingdom that we're walking out of, the land of Egypt. God has destroyed this king, whatever the Pharaoh's name was. God is leading us into the promised land. And Moses walked out with his head held high, not fearing the wrath of the king, but counting him faithful, because he endured as seeing him who was invisible. So that's the first. Number 2 here, we come to verse 28, and we see that he had faith in God's method. Verse 28, through faith, he, Moses, kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. Exodus 12 records the first Passover, the last plague, the death of the firstborn, to fall upon the Egyptians prior to the Exodus. If you look at Genesis 12, verse 12, it says, For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and ye shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. Ye shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. Yes, sir.
Earlier when they said that during the plague, when God had killed all the firstborn, I kind of took that he started with the youngest and just killed them all, but that's not the case. The firstborn was the prize.
Just the first, yes.
They were supposed to carry on the family.
Would be, yeah. When the 10th plague fell, it wiped out all of the heir apparents of Egypt. So yeah, that would have been tremendously devastating to a dynastically ruled empire where this king will give the rule to his son.
Mm-hmm.
It would have stood the culture on its head.
But I think quite often, and you don't hear much of it, but it used to be sometimes when children passed, people were trying to comfort them, saying, you've still got 6 or 8 or 14 left.
Yeah.
But that's of no comfort in this case, and it's really not any comfort today.
Yeah.
It's not. It's kind of an insensitive remark, but
Yeah.
trying to comfort someone.
Yeah.
Because the loss of a child is something that every parent dreads, I think.
Oh,
I think.
Without question. Yeah, I mean you don't have a child and a couple extras. You have as many children as God gave you. And
Right.
that's the way, yeah. And so yeah, that they lost their firstborn would have been a devastating blow. I mean, imagine if everybody in Wayland lost their firstborn in one night. I mean, could you imagine? Imagine the nation. Everybody lost their firstborn, with the exception of a select group of people. The Jews of Goshen didn't lose their firstborn. Why? Well, because, according to this, because they had blood on their door. Because if they put the blood of this lamb that had been sacrificed and eaten by the family, as they prepared for a hasty exit, then they were spared
Should that include
the loss.
the females too? Firstborn, if they was, firstborn was a female.
It says firstborn.
Yeah.
If you were an adult and you were the firstborn, you died.
Yep.
It didn't matter. The firstborn.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that was
first-
included male and female.
Male and female. Yep.
Yeah.
It would have been a devastating, unspeakably terrible, terrible plague.
Do you think that the Pharaoh feared him highly? Because when he shows up, why would they not been thrown in prison or killed or, you know, he came back several times, right, with these plagues?
He came back a handful of times.
Most kings would have said, throw him in there.
Well, he tried that at the end there. Pharaoh said, I will see your face no more. He said, in the day that I see you, you'll die. Well, God brought the plague and Pharaoh kicked Moses out. But yeah, I've wondered the same thing. My thought would be, Pharaoh was probably taking this as a point of pride. I think he was, especially for the longest time. He was viewing this as a competition between my gods and the God of Moses. So I'm gonna let him bring what he's got, and I'll bring and you remember his magicians were able to duplicate some of the plagues. Could you imagine? His magicians made more frogs. I'd be like, no, guys, get rid of frogs. We don't need any more frogs. But his magicians were bringing more frogs and more flies and all of this stuff. But then there comes a point, and I don't remember off the top of my head, where they couldn't do it anymore. And so I think Pharaoh probably had a tremendous fear of Moses. What do you do
Along
for
with a big ego at first, I think.
Oh,
He just
without
didn't
question.
believe Moses could.
Without question. Yeah, he probably, I mean, I got this shepherd from Midian who's coming back. I'm not worried about him. Well, that came back in a big way. But Moses, in this case, here in verse 28, through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. Moses led in obedience to God's specific command. God said, mark your door. Guess what Moses did? He marked his door. Why? Well, because God said so. He obeyed exactly what God had said to do. What would have happened to the Jew, to the Hebrew, who didn't obey exactly what God had said to do? They'd have lost a child or lost their own life if they were the firstborn. We don't have recorded in Scripture. I've always wondered, was there anybody who was just they were obstinate and they thought, I'm not putting blood on my door. Is there any? We don't know. But if that's the case, they'd have lost their child. It would have been a tremendously costly mistake. It took faith to believe that God's wrath would pass over where the blood was present. Again, imagine being in Goshen when an entire nation in one night loses all of their firstborns. You could probably hear the wailing from Goshen, and you're sitting there holding your firstborn a little bit closer that night because I put blood on my door. I'm banking on the fact that God will keep His word.
That even pertains to today, not just for the Jews, but it pertains to all people today. If they don't recognize the blood of Jesus, they're dead too. I mean, their eternity is so. It's the same for us as it was for them. If you don't recognize the blood of Jesus and what He did for you, then you're dead duck.
Passover is probably the most specifically meaningful picture of Christ's sacrifice in the Old Testament. When you look at what it was, when I see the blood, because Hebrews 9:22 tells us, without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. And John 1:29 tells us, behold the Lamb of God, speaking of Jesus, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. If you were in Egypt and you didn't have blood, you lost your child. If you die without the blood of Christ, you lose your soul.
What was the requirement of blood on the doorpost here? Was it supposed to be a lamb? Or was it just
a lamb?
Yeah,
Yep.
lamb. Blood of a lamb.
The lamb that they ate.
They would call it the Paschal lamb or the Passover lamb. They were supposed to have it in their home. If you read up one of these days, we'll look at the Passover ceremony. They were supposed to bring the lamb into their home. What do you think would happen if you brought a little lamb into your home and had it around your kids for a week?
Be a pet.
You'd have a dirty floor, and what else?
Be a pet.
You'd have a pet. And then after a week, you're supposed to cut the thing's throat. What would that do? That'd be hard on your kids, wouldn't it? But again, it's a picture. What's it a picture of? A picture of Christ. And they would slaughter the lamb. They would put its blood into a bowl, take hyssop, and they would mark the doorpost and the lintel, the headboard, and then they would eat the lamb, and then they would dispose of the rest of it. All as a picture. All of the Passover was a picture of what Christ would do. Eventually, as I said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. The picture of Passover that Moses kept by faith is the same as what we accept now. I am acceptable in the eyes of God because he passes over my sin. Why? Because of the blood of Christ. Because I'm covered, atoned.
So the thing is really probably one of the harder things to understand is that everybody had a lamb. But did you not tell us once that if you didn't have a lamb, you had to go out and buy one? Or
in this case, everybody had a lamb. And if in Exodus 12, it was you were responsible to eat all of the lamb. So if you say, well, it's just me and my wife, we can't eat a whole lamb. So what you would do is you could have one lamb for several households. You and your neighbor could come together. And you say, okay, we're gonna have this lamb, and we together. And so they would come over to your house that night, and you would have the lamb, and you would eat
But
eat
did
all.
the blood from that lamb then take care of all the households
Yes.
that ate it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't follow that.
Yeah.
And you had to have it on your doorpost, even though you was over at their house eating.
Right.
You need to have it on your doorpost.
Yeah,
too.
I certainly would. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Does it tell us if Moses was firstborn?
Moses was not. No. Miriam and Aaron were both older than him, but we don't know which one of them was the eldest. Could have been either of them.
I didn't mean to get you off topic.
This is the topic. So I'm glad of the conversation and the input. Let's look at verse 29. Here's another they. Okay? By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned. Who possessed the faith? They did, is what it says. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea. Flip back to Exodus 14. Let's look at they, okay? Let's look at what they did. Exodus 14, verse 10. And when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. So here's the picture. The children of Israel have left Egypt, and they've encamped down by the Red Sea. They're in a tight spot. They can't go anywhere. How long does it take you to get 4 million people to do anything? A long time. Okay, they've set up camp on the edge of the Red Sea, and so suddenly they see Pharaoh's chariots are coming out at them, and so they're crying out for fear. Verse 11. And they said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us, to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness.
Doesn't sound very faithful to me.
I was going to say, yeah, this doesn't sound like overwhelming faith, does it? But they made the hall of fame of faith in Hebrews 11:29. They, by faith, they passed through the Red Sea, and the Egyptians didn't. So what made the difference? Well, that's the reason why this is in connection with Moses. Look at Exodus 14:13. Same passage. And Moses said unto the people, fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you this day. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. Skip to verse 21. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land. And the waters were divided, and the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground. And the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. So where did they get their faith?
Through Moses.
From Moses. From one man who had, we've talked recently about faith the size of a grain of mustard seed. Moses was a man who stood there when 4 million people were saying, let's go back and die in Egypt. Moses said, stop. Go forward. sometimes faith needs to be primed, kind of like an old pump. You got to put a little bit down there, and then it kind of works things up. And when Moses stood up and held up the rod of God, and the seas split, the faith of they that we read about here was increased. And they, borrowing from the faith of one man who walked with God, walked through the Red Sea on dry land. And then the Egyptians tried to do it. They essayed to do it, meaning they tried. And God closed the sea on them. And it brought an end to those Egyptians. Moses' faith in God and his promises was great enough to inspire confidence and faith in 4 million people. That's tremendous faith, isn't it? That's the kind of faith that you would expect to find in the Hall of Faith. So tonight,
Temporary,
go ahead.
temporary.
Temporary.
How can anybody walk through that and then later on be not allowed to, the whole generation had to be dead before they could. And they're the ones
Go into the promised land.
they're the ones that walk through the.
Yeah.
They seen it firsthand, didn't they?
I mean, you think about Moses, the same Moses who helped God, who God used to perform the plagues and split the Red Sea and pull water out of a rock and all of these things. Moses was kept out of but he wasn't kept out of the promised land for lack of faith. And
No, not him. I'm talking about the
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
It wasn't anybody over a certain age. Had to
Yeah.
be,
Anybody over 20.
but they're the ones that went through that,
Yeah.
seen that.
It's amazing because the children of Israel are going to cross the Red Sea and they're going to stop. And they're going to start whining because they don't have water. Right away. It's not weeks. It's just days after that before they started whining. And then days after that they had all sorts of issues. But the faith, they did it by faith. That's not to say that it lasted forever.
But they always went to Moses and he found a way out for them.
To a certain point. And then eventually...
I mean, his poll numbers weren't very high either at times, but...
Oh, it was just Moses and God sometimes. Yeah. You think about when Moses walked down off of the mount, it was Moses, Joshua, and the Levites. And everybody else was against it.
Kind of makes you wonder how Aaron, his family would be the priest.
Grace. That's it. So tonight from Hebrews 11:27, Moses wasn't afraid of the king of Egypt because he was confident in the overwhelming power of God to protect him from the wrath of Pharaoh. That's why he left, not fearing the king. Moses was obedient to the command of God in establishing the powerful illustration that Passover was to be to the Jews, understanding their need for a Messiah. It would be easier with them practicing Passover. Think of how easy it would be for you to come up next to somebody who is practicing Passover in the time of Christ and say, you know what? God himself will provide a lamb. There he is. He's dying on a cross for you. So a picture of what Christ did. And then lastly, Moses' faith was sufficient to inspire faith for the Israelites to step into the midst of the path through the Red Sea in spite of all the doubts and misgivings they had. And they had a lot. And that, as Andy mentioned, it didn't get rid of all of them, but it did allay them, and they were able to pass through by faith.